The Crimea, September 14th, 1854. A Russian officer looks out on a sea of masts. 400 British and French ships crowd the bay, reminding him of the Moscow skyline choked with cathedral spires. At night, they glittered like a city on the waves. And a city it is, at least in population. For swarming ashore from the ships are 57,000 British, French, and Ottoman troops, all headed for the port of Sevastopol. But when the Russian scouts report back, their commander, Prince Menshikov, isn't concerned. While the Russians may have 20,000 fewer men, they've fortified the heights above the river, positioning 100 cannons toward the landing allies. He's made an uphill killing ground to welcome them, and one he believes can hold for 3 weeks. Soon, this obscure river will be famous worldwide, its name transmitted over telegraph wires and spoken with awe in a dozen languages. The Battle of the Alma. Thanks so much to Trade Coffee for helping to keep us history-loving beans caffeinated. Though the Allied landings looked impressive from a distance, most soldiers on the beach could see they were a disorganized mess. The British troops in particular looked haunted and discouraged. See, most recruits had expected to ship right to the Crimea in order to take Sevastopol, but instead, they'd been dumped ashore at Varna to gather strength and wait for orders. The army waited there for 3 months, rotting amid a massive sea of tents. So, while thousands of British troops had marched out of home villages and cities singing upbeat songs like "Cheer, boys, cheer," they weren't singing much anymore. Actually, the final line of that ballad, "Farewell England, farewell forevermore," had now taken on a more ghoulish undertone. Cholera, camp fevers, and diarrhea swept through the ranks, infecting nearly every soldier. And men who died were buried in shallow graves, their stiffening hands emerging from the dirt after a hard rain, like a garden of fingers beckoning their comrades to join them. Disease killed 10,000 men before they even loaded their rifles. And it was around this point that the British started to notice something. Their commanders didn't seem, good at this. The British army hadn't fought against a modernized opponent since Waterloo, and since officers could purchase promotions, rank often reflected wealth and status rather than ability. Lord Cardigan, commander of the British Light Brigade, was a classic specimen. Having bought his way up to Major General, he refused to live in camp, instead sleeping aboard his private yacht, as all great military men do. So the result was a class of military officers who were more gentlemen than professionals. Plus, no one knew where anything was in the British camp at Varna. Logistics were snarled, and medical care, when it existed at all, was incredibly basic. The commissariat, tasked with providing supplies and pay, was part of the Treasury Department and was more focused on its budget rather than the troops. The overall British commander, Lord Raglan, moved around so much that no one ever knew where to find him. Now, Raglan had been a hero of the Napoleonic Wars, and lost an arm at Waterloo, but was also old and set in his ways. In fact, he was known for pointing at the Russian lines and falling into old habits, referring to the enemy as the French. Ironically, British troops soon realized that their French allies were better organized and led. Having imbibed many lessons from the Revolution, French officers were professionally promoted due to ability, and they had a tight hand on logistics, transport, and military medicine. Many French, particularly the famous Zouaves, Frenchmen recruited from Algeria, also had campaign experience. Their general, Saint Arnaud, was a ruthless officer, known for commanding the Foreign Legion in Algeria, where he became infamous for his massacres, once killing 500 Arab tribesmen by sealing them in a cave. He was, however, at this point deeply ill with stomach cancer. But regardless of what flag they fought under, or what experience they had, every soldier had been waiting for the day of battle. A moment that would make all of their weeks of disease and suffering worthwhile, and cover them in glory. Yet when that day arrived, it was a mess. September 20th, 1854, River Alma. Nothing, it seems, is going like it's supposed to. The plan was for the British to make a frontal attack at first light, while the French Zouaves scaled the bluffs to take the higher ground behind the Russian artillery. But the British weren't ready on time, and for hours, the infuriated French had to delay. Finally, the British infantry line advances up the heights and across the river. At first, the cannonballs are coming from far enough that the troops can just step aside as they bounce through the ranks, but the closer they get, the more the artillery rips into them. Then suddenly, a village along their march detonates. Russian engineers had stuffed it with straw and gunpowder, and now the British line breaks into 2 parts, losing cohesion. Yet things are not going well for Prince Menshikov either. He'd been so sure of victory, again that he could hold these heights for 3 weeks, that he'd actually invited the best families of Sevastopol to picnic and watch the battle. but he hadn't counted on the new mini rifles the British have adopted, giving them a range and accuracy advantage over the Russians' smoothbore muskets. His gunners are hurting the British, but they're also dying as they do so and are nearly overrun. Civilian onlookers then abandon their picnic blankets and flee the battlefield in fine coaches. Oh boy, okay, to lose his artillery pieces would be a disgrace, as well as tactically unsound. They will be needed at Sevastopol, so he orders his cannons dragged away from their positions and tells the infantry to take their place. The advancing Russian infantry crashes into the British, cresting the slope, sending the mauled units into a backwards retreat that runs into and disorders the units coming up from behind to reinforce them. Men are dying, screaming, as an abandoned parasol rolls across the battlefield in a breeze. Then from behind, Menshikov hears the crack of rifles. More men fall. The French have seized the hills behind them, and more British are in range. It's over. The line he'd swore would hold for 3 weeks has fallen within hours. He orders a pullback to Sevastopol, but most of his men are already running. Through a spyglass, Lord Raglan sees his Russian enemies begin to retreat. Yeah, he's actually behind them, having made the bizarre decision to ride past British lines into Russian ones to better observe the fighting. Had they pursued, Menshikov's army might have been destroyed and Sevastopol taken within days. But ironically, Raglan's insistence on speed had actually slowed the army down. They had no carts to ferry wounded back to the landing site, or cavalry to pursue. And the Allies had taken over 4,000 casualties and really needed to recover. Meanwhile, scouts reported back that Sevastopol was essentially open for the taking. The whole point of this expedition, the destruction of Russia's naval base on the Black Sea, could be achieved in one fell swoop. But Raglan, along with his commanders, had a better idea. If there was to be a siege, it should be a traditional one, with heavy guns and a staging ground close by. Yeah. They would march around Sevastopol and take the port of Balaclava. Then, when they had sufficient artillery and supplies, they'd besiege it from the south. This move puzzled many, including a journalist from the Times of London, William Howard Russell. One of the first war correspondents, he was simultaneously awed by the bravery of the fighting men and disgusted by the deplorable conditions, extreme violence, and what he saw as the incompetence of Raglan and the aristocratic officer class. His accounts, carried by ship, would increasingly begin to shape public opinion of the war. Meanwhile, in Sevastopol, civilians were panicking in anticipation of an Allied force that would surely storm the city. Yet, as we already know, a force that never came. Instead, Prince Menshikov arrived with the remnants of his army to meet with the leaders of the Black Sea Fleet. All depended on Sevastopol now, and the admirals had a brilliant, if unpalatable plan. They took Russia's proud Black Sea Fleet, the victors of Sinop, and sunk it. They strategically scuttled the vessels around Sevastopol to create a blocking reef of shipwrecks to prevent naval attack. The crews and all guns, however, would come ashore and form the core of the city's garrison in the upcoming siege. Menshikov would keep his army in the field, securing the supply lines to transport food and reinforcements into the city, while also looking for an opportunity to strike. And among those reinforcements would be the aristocrat artilleryman Leo Tolstoy, whose dispatches home would define Russian views of the conflict as much as Russell's journalism shaped the British. And after Alma, that's where things stood. The Allies establishing a base at their new port, waiting for heavy guns, giving the Russian Navy weeks to fortify Sevastopol against attack. But things would not be stagnant for long. For 1 month after Alma, Menshikov finally marched for the Allies' new port in a battle that would become renowned for brave stands and suicidal charges. The Battle of Balaclava and the Charge of the Light Brigade. And listen, if we're going to ride headlong into this infamous military foobar, I am going to need way more caffeine. Right on time trade coffee, here we go.
All right, everyone, take 5 for beans.
We've loved working with Trade because myself and most of the EC crew drink a lot of coffee, and we're always on the lookout for new roasts, specifically from independent roasters using ethically and sustainably sourced beans. So yeah, telling you all about Trade's coffee delivery service is kind of a match made in caffeinated heaven for us. Now, their whole thing is to enable you to not only make the best cup of coffee at home specifically to your tastes every day, but also helping you to discover new favorite coffees with each delivery. Case in point, I am, of course, still a down and dirty French press boy, so not only did Trade's website match my personalized optimized tastes with a great blend from one of their many New York roasters, but then the beans were actually roasted and ground fresh to my preferred brewing method within 48 hours of when I ordered, and then delivered right to my doorstep, aka zero hassle and ready to make the moment it arrived, and whew, that is the stuff. Whereas Jeff, as we know, is more of an espresso guy with his fancy schmancy latte machine. Only the most minimal of shade there, Jeff. So he opted for dark roast whole beans from an indie roaster to grind himself. Then, of course, when we inevitably argued about which brewing method is better, we ended up just talking about the coffees that trade matched us with, because ever since we did that History of Coffee episode, we are just huge nerds for this sort of thing. So if you would like to join us in upgrading your morning routine with just a way better cup of coffee, right now is a perfect time to do it, because Trade is offering all of you fine folks one free bag of coffee with any subscription if you use our link drinktrade.com/extra credits. And then once you sign up, not only will you be getting the best coffee beans in the business, but you'll also be supporting us beans by making us look really good to a sponsor we enjoy working with. Thank you so much for that. Once again, that is drinktrade.com/extra credits. The link, of course, is in the description, or you can click right up there if it's easier. Thanks so much for listening, and seriously, happy brewing. You're gonna love this stuff. What if I told you that Ahmed Ziad Turk, Angelo Valenciana, Arclight Games, Casey Mustia, Dominic Valenciana, Joseph Blame, Kuya Koi, and Skylar Holmes were all legendary patrons? I'm not kidding.